Although it's a staple of Wild West movies, the first armed bank robbery actually occurred in 1863 in Malden, Massachusetts.
Daddy wasn't finding a pow wow. Daddy wasn't finding a pow wow. I love my little cat. I'm very fond of that. I'd rather have a big bow wow 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 wow.
Hello, and welcome to the Mochiverse, or should I say, howdy, partner.
Howdy. How's that?
Much better. I'm Linette.
And I'm Skip.
And today we're not drunk, I promise. I mean, I can speak for myself. You're not drunk, are you, Dad?
No, not this time. No.
Okay. Today, we're going to be talking about a gunslinger?
Yeah, he's a real cool character. And I think it's one that had big influence on a lot of the culture in the country, especially in the last century. Our obsession with the Wild West and movies that focus on the Wild West.
All right. That sounds good
All
to
right.
me. So who's this guy we're talking about?
Well, you see that a lot of the Westerns focus on the lone gunslinger out for vengeance. And they usually seem a bit unrealistic but entertaining. But this guy, known as Pistol Pete, he was the real deal.
Pistol Pete. I will disclose that every time I've looked up Pistol Pete, I always get basketball references, college basketball references. So
Pistol Pete Maravich, right?
All right,
And I think that's kind of where the name got copied. Frank Eaton is this gentleman's name. He was known as Pistol Pete. He lived a life worthy of legend. You might be wondering, the name sounds familiar, just like we were just talking about. That's because Pistol Pete is the mascot for Oklahoma State University, the University of Wyoming, and New Mexico State University. Yeah, Frank Eaton, Pistol Pete, was a cowboy, Indian fighter, and U.S. Deputy Marshal, scout, and author. He was born on October 26, 1980, in Hartford, Connecticut. And when he was about 8 years old, him and his family moved to a homestead in Twin Mountains, Kansas. That very year, his father, a Union Army veteran, became involved in a dispute with several Confederate men who had ridden with Quantrill's raiders during the Civil War. Not sure what the dispute was about. Maybe he didn't want to go along with something they were going to do.
right.
A short time later, 6 of the men appeared at their home, and Frank's father was shot in cold blood right in front of the boy.
Oh, jeez.
One of the shooters actually emptied his gun into his father's body, and afterwards they kicked and bullwhipped Frank. Remember, he was only 8 years old.
God, that's horrific.
Yeah. These 6 men were from the Campsie and the Ferber clans, and they rode with vigilante Southerners who, after the war, called themselves Regulators.
Oh.
Just for reference, some of these members of Regulators later became KKK.
Yeah, I've heard about the Regulators. Okay, all right. That puts that in a lot of context for me. Okay.
Days later, trying to recover from the shock of what he saw, a neighbor and family friend, Mose Beeman, talked to him about the tragedy. His father said to Frank, "Hey, my boy, may an old man's curse rest upon you if you do not try to avenge your father." That same year, Mose taught him how to handle a gun.
I guess it
It
was
was a different time. I mean, you're talking about an 8-year-old boy, right?
Right.
And the thing that Mose understood was that vengeance works best in the hands of someone who with specialized skills, someone, who would know how to handle a revolver or a rifle.
Right.
Mose gave Frank an old Navy revolver and taught him how to use it. I think the revolver was pretty easy to deal with. Once you shoot once and it rotates to the next shell, then he can continue shooting.
Okay.
He practiced to a point where he became proficient and to should be able to shoot with either hand. And he worked extra hard to refine his skills. When he was about 15 years old, he had earned the nickname of Pistol Pete for his superior gun handling skills and deadly shots. It's a remarkable feat, considering that Eaton had been born with a crossed left eye.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, however, he overcame that disability by figuring out how to aim a gun without sighting down the barrel. He was so good that it was said that he could shoot the head off a snake with either hand. Now, when we've all seen, and I'm sort of guilty of as anybody, when I see in the westerns how they'll shoot from the hip and actually be deadly accurate, I always felt like that was not something that was either easy to do or normal. But this guy worked on it to the point where he was able to do it without aiming. If you think about it, you aim down the pistol. That's kind of
Right.
the typical way I thought it was.
I imagine when you're learning to shoot, even if you're cross-eyed, I mean, you compensate based on what you're looking at. It's kind of like driving a new car. You know, you kind of get a feel for where everything is, and you can kind of put everything in perspective when you're doing it. So I guess, you know, he would be aiming the way he's used to being aiming. This is going to be a really bad example, or it's going to sound weird, but the point of the scene was not this. But do you remember in Full Metal Jacket, after the basic training was over and he's in the helicopter?
Yeah.
He's observing this guy shooting at people, Matthew Modine's character, and he's asking if he kills women and children. And he says, how could you shoot women and children? And he says, it's easy. You just don't lead them so much, which he's referring to. It's easy to aim.
About, but yeah,
it's not. Well, it's funny, but it's not funny. It's like he wasn't asking how technically you could hit them because they're women and children and they run differently and you don't lead them as much. But the guy had no idea. And the guy was like, yeah, it's easy. You just don't lead them so much. I always found that to be one of the best lines in the movie because it's so dark. But also it's like, yeah, that's the guy's answering his question.
Yeah. And I would imagine, as I said earlier, you know, he would be aiming down the barrel of the gun. He still wanted to learn more, even so that he was still pretty good. He went to Fort Gibson in Oklahoma, and but instead of learning, he ended up competing with some of the cavalry's best marksmen, beating them every time. His reputation as packing the truest and fastest guns in Indian Territory was born. He was so accomplished that this is where he got his nickname. The commanding officer of the fort, Eaton, gave him a marksmanship. Yeah, sure. This is my New England accent coming out.
It's
Marksmanship badge, and dubbed him with the nickname Pistol Pete. So,
that's good.
Yeah. So at that point, his skills as a teenager, gave him enough confidence to begin the hunt for the 6 men who killed his father. Mm-hmm. He tracked them down one by one. Again, this is a story of vengeance, and you can understand why he did it. Just give you a quick synopsis. It's like the first one, Shannon Campsey. He approached Shannon Campsey, and Shannon Campsey was sitting on his front porch, and he just drew down on him, and he shot and killed him. Wow. And the next one was Doc Ferber. He was riding up to Doc Ferber's house, and Doc Ferber started confronting him, and he shot him twice in the chest while he was on horseback.
Wow.
That's remarkable by itself because, you know, I don't think he can aim that well. John Ferber, another one of the people responsible for his father, was killed cheating at cards, and it was not done by Eaton. However, he went to the funeral just to make sure he was dead. You know, at Ferber's funeral, the story continues, is at this point, he met a deputy U.S. Marshal who happened to be tracking the same gang. Mm-hmm. So at the age of 17, he was the youngest U.S. Deputy Marshal to ever be commissioned in the Western District, Fort Smith, Arkansas. He served under the hanging judge, Isaac Parker. His territory extended, you know, all through Arkansas. Now think about this Isaac Parker. Remember Hang'em High? There was the hanging judge.
Right.
You know, if you think of the similarity, these folks were sent out, and there was a group of deputies that were sent out just like Clint Eastwood's character was in that movie. And his thing was vengeance, but all along the way, he was still doing other parts of the job. And then eventually he ran into the folks that hung him, which is the premise of Hang'em High.
Right.
But now, if you think about it, now he had a badge which gave him legal authority to go after these folks. And they were, understand some of these weren't just ordinary folks. They were rustlers, thieves, and murderers. So it wasn't like he was just going after somebody, an ordinary farmer or something like that.
Right. Yeah, these are bad dudes.
These are bad dudes. Next, he caught up with Jim and John Campsey, and both men drew on him at the same time. And he shot them both and killed them. And he left their bodies in place because when he went back to town, there was a lot of controversy about whether he just outright murdered them. So he left everything in place and brought the authorities out there to view the site to verify how it happened. And obviously he was cleared on that story.
Yeah, that's interesting because you don't really think now all the stuff that my generation had watched, all the movies, the Western movies, you get this impression that the Wild West is like just lawlessness. But what a lot of people don't realize is that duels, things like that, were all completely illegal, and they actually enforced those laws. And so they would actually investigate crimes sometimes.
Yeah,
which you don't really
shoot.
Yeah, you could just shoot people. And I was like, but they couldn't back then, because it seemed like they could a lot back then if you watched any of those movies.
Yeah, a lot, all along the way with, as a deputy marshal, now I sort of compressed this. There was still one person left that he was seeking revenge on. But all the while he was going through this, he was a deputy marshal. And when he caught up with these folks, it wasn't like a direct path to each one. All along the way, he was assigned with other things like catching rustlers. One of the common things, he worked in Cherokee Nation, and he was worked under a Marshal Six Killer, who was a Cherokee, and they had a group of marshals. And what was going on at that time was that they were cattle thieves, and they were stealing from the Indians, the Cherokees. So this group of marshals, their job was to go get these rustlers. And by the way, rustling was a pretty big crime. And a lot of times
it was a hanging crime, right?
It was a hanging crime. And a lot of times they carried out the justice on the spot. So there was all kinds of adventures along the way, all kinds of different things he did, all kinds of different confrontations he had with different rustlers. And all the while, it wasn't like he was singularly dedicated to the vengeance. He was dedicated to justice. Okay.
Right.
Now, the last one, and just so I could get this kind of the vengeance part of it out of the way, Wiley Capsey was the last of the gang. He had gone to New Mexico. And when Frank was just in a saloon in New Mexico, he happened to spot him. And he wanted to do something right then with him. But there was a sheriff in the town, Sheriff Pat Garrett. I think folks have heard of that. That's the one that famously,
I've heard that name.
That's right. The one that famously killed Billy the Kid. So Pat Garrett pulled him aside and says, "Hey, I get you trying to do vengeance. What's going on?" And so he explained the whole thing to him. And Pat Garrett says, "Okay, I'm going to stay out of the way." He says, "and I could assist you if you want, because there's not only is it Wiley, he's got two associates, two gunmen, hired guns to protect him."
Right.
He says, "So I could help you." And Frank says, "Nope, I can handle it myself."
Huh.
So after Pat Garrett says, hey, you know what? Go ahead. So this is the way the story went. He went back into the saloon. And by the way, Wiley was, I don't know if I said he was a bartender. So he went back in the saloon. He says, "Hey, Wiley, do you remember me?" Wiley says, "No, I've never seen you before." "Oh, yes, you have. It was the night you killed my father. I'm Frank Eaton. Remember? Fill your hand, you son of a bitch." He killed all three men and has sustained 2 wounds from the fight. And according to Frank, Pat Garrett helped him get his wounds tended to. Now, you want to think about that line. That line was spoken by John Wayne in True Grit.
Yeah.
Fill your hands, you son of a bitch. It was said by Pistol Pete before he gunned them down, those folks down. And that, by the way, that's a direct quote from his book, Veteran of the West. What I've been speaking about before, these are all direct quotes from this book because I read this book recently.
Right.
And the most famous scene in the Charles Portis 1968 novel, True Grit, is pure Pistol Pete. It was documented in his 1952 autobiography. Instead of being a fat, one-eyed marshal, it was young Eaton with his long hair and braids, bringing rustlers to reckoning in a meadow near Webbers Falls, Oklahoma. So you see, that incident was the whole highlight of True Grit. was basically something Frank Eaton did.
Right.
Fascinating
Yeah.
stuff. It's just,
it is fascinating. I mean, that's pretty badass too. Like, and it's also, and we'll talk about this after, it's definitely giving Inigo Montoya vibes.
Yeah. But what I didn't mention here, by the way, the whole thing was he carried 2 guns. You see this in movies, and sometimes I think that's overdone, and it's not really true. But this guy carried 2 6 guns. And when he killed these guys, he used both guns. It's just,
wow.
It took him 6 years, but he avenged his father's murder. Like I said, he worked in the Indian Territory. So he wasn't just a vengeful dude. He was going after groups of criminals that steal horses and cattle from the Indians.
Right.
He had, during his career, he was involved in several gunfights. He was known to carry a pair of, I just alluded to, 45 pistols on his hips. In his own words, straight from the book, throwing a lot of lead fast and straight, which is what he did.
Wow.
Yeah, so he's a cool guy. There was another incident that I found interesting, and I've talked to you about this. It was he had a thing with this gentleman, Bud Wells. He was in a bar, and he saw this guy sitting having dinner, and he recognized him right away because he had seen a picture of him. The guy said to him, "You know who I am?" He says, "Yeah, I know. You're Bud Wells." He says, "Do you have a warrant for my arrest?" And he goes, "No, I don't, but I know that there is a warrant out for you." And he says, "Listen, I would hate to send you to hell on an empty stomach." By the way, this is direct quote from the book. Ben said back to him, "The same back at you. And we could wait till after dinner to start." Think of it. Okay. And then Bud says, "Listen, let's have the winner pay for both feeds. I have enough money." Frank said, yeah, sure, I have enough. And Cy, who was the bartender, can collect the loss if I don't have it. Okay. And so Cy said, "I'm not going to be here. If you damn fools want to smoke things up, I'm going for a walk." He put on his hat and walked out the door. So they both had a good laugh about that. And Cy said, "Listen, laugh, you damn fools, but remember, he who laughs last laughs the longest." And then he left. So Bud finished eating, and he rolled a smoke. And Frank sitting there, he says, "Man, I thought my time had come." He says, I got grease all over my hands. I got to clean it up. And he says, "Man, it'd be a fine thing if I could shoot Bud's gun out of his hand." Because he said, every time I've had a gunfight, I've had to kill somebody. And he says, I'd really like for once not to have to do that. Mm-hmm. He was kind of tired of it. He says, "I've never taken a prisoner who I had to confront. So maybe this would be a good one to start on." So Bud lit up his smoke and looked at him as Cy struck out the back door. And then he's sitting there smoking, and his fingers were perfectly steady. And all the time, he must have been thinking, well, either he or I are going to be dead in a few minutes. So he says, "Okay." I got up and we started facing each other. He said, "Yes, I'm ready. Get your iron," which is kind of,
right.
you hear this smoke wagon and all this other stuff from other movies. So they both drew, and Bud's gun went off just a split second late and fell to the floor. My bullet had hit the handle of his gun and cut his hand at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah, stooping over, went to pick up his gun, and he said, "You win, kid. You beat me. I didn't think a man who could do it. Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that? How did you make that draw? I bet you're a Texan." He says, "Wrong. I learned both in Kansas." It's like, hell, no damn jaywalker ever did a draw on me and shoot like that. "But why didn't you drill me? You're too good a man to kill," he said. "I wanted to give you a chance to live a good, clean life." Wow. Bud says, "I can't believe you did this. I'm going to reform my life. True to my word, I will reform my life." And so, Frank says, "I believe you." And he went a place and fixed up his hand. And then they rode out, took him in. And the whole time he was riding along, Bud still had his rifle on his horse. And never once did he try to do anything. He was true to his word. Brought him back. They arrested him. Years later, he got a letter from a store clerk in a town. Mm-hmm. And he said, it was Bud. He says, I've reformed my ways. I married a good woman. I have children. And he says, I'm very happy. I want to thank you.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
You know, when you read something, again, this is a direct thing from the book. When you read something like that and you go, man, you know, and this guy, it wasn't just like an ordinary cowpoke. He was well read, and this book was, I thought, was well written.
That impresses me too, because you don't really get that from the stereotype of that era.
Yeah, you don't. You know, you don't think that they would have access to reading materials. I guess that's the best way to describe it. You know, so
that and no schooling and no sort of.
Yeah, no formal schooling. You know, they didn't.
I mean, if you're 8 years old and your parents, you know.
Yeah, and they would work on farms. You know,
right.
That's the way their life is. After that time, you know, he still did some work with the Marshals. He went back to Barkersdale, Oklahoma, and there was this gal he was sweet on in Barkersdale. But Frank was kind of shy, never approached her to ask for a date or anything. And he had to go out. He had an assignment from Captain Sixkiller to go after some rustlers. And so Jenny gave him this crucifix to wear around his neck. And the crucifix came in handy later when he was in a shootout with these rustlers. It deflected a bullet that would have taken him in the chest.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and he would later write of this instance. He said, I'd rather have the prayers of a good woman in a fight than a half a dozen hot guns. She's taken me to headquarters. Wow. Unfortunately, Frank never got the opportunity to thank Jenny because she died of pneumonia. And he buried the cross at the head of her grave. He was obviously pretty downtrodden about this because he was going to start dating her, and eventually he wanted to marry her.
That story about the bullet being stopped. You hear a lot of stories like that. As a matter of fact, James Doohan, who played Scotty in Star Trek, one of his injuries on D-Day, apparently he was shot 6 times. Yep. One of the shots hit a cigarette case that he had in his pocket and protected him.
When you read these books, autobiographies, and I like this, particularly this autobiography, and there are probably others that are like this, and you can see where the inspiration comes for certain scenes in movies, which we find memorable.
Oh, absolutely.
So more about him. He married Ophrah Pearl Miller in August 1890. They had 2 daughters. Tragically, she passed away in 1902. But he knew he needed help raising his daughters. So he married Anna Rosetta Silix in 1903, and they had additional 8 children. He raised 10 children.
Wow.
Yeah, he had some other things that he did. It was he was a government steward during the 1889 land rush, charged with preventing border crossovers from Sooner. And what is a Sooner? A Sooner is the name first applied about 6 months after the land run of 1889 to people who entered the Oklahoma district unassigned lands before the designated time. In other words, they said, okay, you can't start till now. But the Sooners were the ones that would, basically stealing lands, jumping to the head of the line, which we don't all like, right?
Don't they still call themselves that in Oklahoma?
Yes, they call themselves Sooners. It's right.
Yeah. Okay.
He was a charter member of the Cherokee Strip Cowpunchers Association, formed in 1920. In 1950, Frank and several Native American chiefs sponsored a university study to better understand leaders and pioneers of the Old West. He was a constable in Payne County, Oklahoma. He served as a scoutmaster, teaching crafts and how to survive on your own. He broke horses into his 60s. He worked on a railroad, sold war bonds in World War II. After his death, he was inducted into the Hall of Great Westerners. He was a self-educated man who had a full set of encyclopedias, and he read everything in them. What I said about well-read man. He wrote a couple of books about the Old West. One was an autobiography, Pistol Pete, Veteran of the Old West, which details his life as a U.S. deputy marshal and cowboy. It was quite an extensive book. As I say, I read it, and I couldn't get into all the stories. I just selected, 1 or 2 stories which I thought were unique. The second book, entitled Campfire Stories, Remembrance of a Cowboy Legend, didn't get published till 30 years after his death. Earlier in his life, Frank was adopted by Jasper Exedine. Jasper Exedine and his wife had lost some children, and they couldn't have any more children. And his mother allowed them to adopt him, and Jasper Exedine raised him. And this is what he wrote at Jasper's grave. Well, so long, partner. May the drought never hit your range, and may you always have a free horse and an easy saddle on the trail, with plenty of good grass and wood and pure, sweet water at the sundown campgrounds. That was the wish of Frank Eaton.
That's really sweet.
It is, really. He bit the dust, as is appropriate. He bit the dust on April 8th, 1958. He was 97 years old. Hey, yeah, your birthday. Yeah.
My birthday.
Yeah. That same year, that's when Oklahoma State adopted Pistol Pete as its mascot. In 1984, the university officially licensed the familiar caricature of Pistol Pete. Another quote from Pistol Pete: "I'd rather have a pocket full of rocks than an empty gun." I know I had told you this whole story, and I hope that it impressed you as much as it impressed me. This was a guy, and Lynn, you and I talked about this, and this wasn't just a cowboy or someone out for vengeance. This was a well thought out, well educated man that ran into a lot of different things, and all along the way there was a lot of times he did it on his own. That was probably because of started out because of the vengeance thing. He knew he had to depend on himself. What are your thoughts on this, Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, he sounds really impressive. He sounds like he's at the same time, he's exactly what you think of when you think of cowboy, lone gunman, sort of, guy on the range. But he's also the exact opposite of what you think of, because you would not expect him to have such a complex personality, such a complex set of values. He seems, I said this before, he seems pretty progressive for a guy from that era.
Yes.
I mean, you told me that he worked with the Native Americans a lot in way of their protection. He worked with them when crimes were being committed against them. Things were being stolen from them, their horses and their livestock. And yeah, he sounds just amazing. He sounds like he's got everything going on. I mean, he got really good at what he needed to do with, shooting guns, and he seemed very singularly focused on his task, but he also made a career out of, I imagine he was pretty smart about it and said, I'm going to have to make a living, and this kind of living that I'm going to have to make, might as well do this because it'll make it easier to do the thing I have to do. I got to get these guys. And what better way to be able to get these guys than be in the system that can find them and take care of them. And the well-read thing really surprised me. I love that. But every single thing you've told me about this guy, my brain can't stop thinking about Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride. I know I've mentioned it a million times. But for the sake of our show, I'll say it again. I am 100% certain that William Goldman, who wrote The Princess Bride, has read Pistol Pete's book. I'm 100% certain. And I'm 100% certain that he was inspired by it. When people ask William Goldman how he came up for the idea of The Princess Bride, he said his kids wanted him to write a story. And one of the kids said, I want a story about a princess. And one of the kids said, I want a story about a bride. But I think that's bullshit. I think he wanted to write a story about Pistol Pete. Because he had this guy. It's exactly Inigo Montoya's story, down to him being a child, seeing his father get killed, going after, instead of 6 men, a 6-fingered man. Very interesting. Yep. And also that scene in The Princess Bride where Wesley is climbing up the cliffs and he's waiting for him. He's making conversation with him. He's like slow going, and he's like, do you mind if I just concentrate on this task, before you kill me? He's like, oh, sure, no problem. I got all day. And he sits there. And then after he helps him climb up the cliffs. He says, no, 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 you rest. I want you to be well rested before I fight you. Wouldn't be fair otherwise.
Yeah.
He's like, hey, you seem like a really cool guy. He's like, oh, yeah. And he said, like, you know, you seem like a very nice man. I hate to kill you. And Wesley says, you seem like a nice man. I hate to be killed.
Think about it, you know, yeah. And like I said, there again, there's another parallel, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I had said to you, when you did this research too, and I first thing I think of when I saw pictures of Pistol Pete, I'm thinking, you know, Willie Nelson could probably play him, you know.
Right, because of the braids, right?
Yes, because of the braids, you know, and to look at him, I imagine very unassuming. And a lot of what he did, you know, with the revenge thing was while he was still a teenager. I felt he wrote some profound things. And this was one thing he wrote. It's called On a Star. After your loved ones die, they live on a star so that they can watch over you, watch the stars at night. And if you look long enough, the one where you loved one lives will shine brighter than any of the other stars. If you will ask Joaquin Taka, the great Indian spirit, he will let the loved one send you down a message that you can feel in your heart, a message of love and good counsel. Many times I have lain on the ground at night looking up at the stars, and after a while, one of them seems brighter. As you look, you feel the presence of the loved one on that star. You seem to feel her understanding and love. You may be planning something that would be the wrong thing to do. As you watch the star, many times you will change your plans, as though you have been guided by an invisible hand. Try it. You will find your loved one on the brightest star.
Wow. Okay, first of all, that is incredibly sweet and very well written. Like, you're not wrong about this guy's writing talents. This is freaking amazing. But also, what really gets me too, so it seems like he not only worked with the Native Americans quite a bit, but he seems like he felt like he was really talking to them, really getting to know them and embracing some of their beliefs. And like, this is not a time when there was a lot of respect going on for Native Americans. This was not a time when anybody wanted to understand any of their culture. There was none of that kind of culture going on with our country, as far as how they treated the Native Americans and how they thought about them. It seems like he was just like really invested in so many good things. And I'm really impressed with his not just his collaboration with the Native Americans, but it seems like he really pursued an understanding of their culture and how they thought about things. And he seems like he's philosophical also. Like, he's not just doing the damn thing. Like, again, what you would think of as a cowboy thing. You know, I'm a simple man. I just doing the thing. No, he like was really like living with a capital L his life, which is very cool. Because like, I don't fault anybody for just coasting through life and doing a task and doing a thing, but it is so much better. And I highly recommend that people really think about stuff in their life and really think about their life and really like live what, you know, if you were to get to know me, you wouldn't think I'm capital L living my life the way that most people do when they demonstrate that. Like, I don't go hiking and shit. You know what I mean? I don't jump off of buildings. I don't do adventures. But internally and philosophically, I am always trying to figure stuff out and live my life and like just be here. Not just to be here, but to be a part of things. And I really think that's cool. I'm very surprised. I'm still very surprised, but I'm impressed.
I was when I first started reading about this, and I saw, you know, a lot of the bios, and then when I got the book, and it was like I was so impressed and affected by what I read. It was just amazing, considering the time that he lived in. You know, there was another instance like this Captain Six Killer, who was the marshal that was the head of the Cherokee Marshals. One time he went out searching for some rustlers, and they ambushed him and killed him. He never even got a chance to take out his gun. And the posse went after them. And to quote Frank, we found the two murderers. They were shot in a fight with the posse, like the dogs that they were. And the posse didn't lose a single man in the fight.
Right.
Think about this is, when you hear about the Cowboys and Indians, so you talk about this Cherokee Indian that there was so much respect for, that cowards take their life and the cowards got the reward that they deserved. So,
right. Well, which is good. And you also don't hear a lot about that. Like, how come this didn't bleed? Okay, so we talked a lot off mic about this guy and how much influence he had over the way that books and films were made about the West.
Yep.
But it seems to me, and although there is a lot of inspiration, like you get a lot of feelings, like, oh, this guy's a real badass. It seems like this, and I've seen this in this movie, and it feels like, but you know what? I think they lost something. I think they missed the point a little bit. I think there's a lot that's lost in translation. Like, why couldn't our culture have been ingrained with, like, this dude's philosophies,
Yes.
instead of just the badassery? Like, are we considered that shallow that we couldn't have been given those lessons to take away? And I were they just so afraid of having us growing up with respect for Native Americans?
Yeah.
Maybe, because what would happen? What would happen if we figured out, like, that we took all their land from them and they treated them unfairly, and then this is their home and all that kind of? What would happen if we figured out we're the baddies? We'd feel bad about ourselves.
Yeah, and I think in some cases, in some movies, they address that, but not as much as
well, yeah. It's always like the lone. Wow, this one's friendly. This one's actually nice to us. This one's not killing us on our ranch. This. Oh, it's okay. We have a good relationship with this tribe because these are the good ones. Like, that's even worse somehow. You know what I mean? It's like 200 years of propaganda. Oh, it's awful. Anyway, no politics. This is not a podcast about politics.
The more I read it, and the more as I'm reading the book, and I think that some of the singularly most impressive. If you think he worked for a hanging judge, and he spent most of his time in the Cherokee territory, working with marshals. So I'm just rehashing these kind of things. There was a story in there, but I really don't want to. I really want to get into it because I don't remember the details of it. I think there was one. Most of the time, it was one about an Indian that was not very good. Most of the time, it was all pretty positive. There were. That's the thing I found with it all was there's more of positive things about the relationships, and he and his friend would go to the Indian lodges and listen to their stories. So you get a lot of wisdom from that too. So
yeah, I definitely get that sense, and it's too bad there wasn't more of that happening, because when you understand where someone is coming from, you're less likely to do bad things to them systemically. That's just how I feel about that.
Yeah, and I think the sense is I think you and I talked offline about this was that the rustlers took a lot of advantage of the Indians, and I think the reason that they did was because there was such a negative press, if you will, about Indians and how they were. So they figured if we steal from the Indians, nobody's going to really care.
Correct. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's definitely the way we did that thing.
Yeah. As you can see from reading what I wrote and listening to me tell the stories from his book and the stories of his life, you can see why I got kind of interested in doing this particular piece.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's really cool. He seems like a really fascinating character. He seemed like he was very surprisingly multidimensional, also badass, which is, there's nothing wrong with that. If you're going to be multidimensional and badass, that's fine.
Yeah, one of the dimensions, in the, if you think about this, he was still doing his quick draw well into his 90s and still pretty fast. impressing people. There were at the end of this book, there were a lot of different pictures of of people in his life, like his best friend, his adopted father, Captain Six Killer, and the hanging judge, and they were all, and then Frank sitting on his favorite horse.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was pretty impressive guy.
Yeah, I mean, what a contrast to what you grow up with thinking of as. I mean, we learn more about Buffalo Bill,
Yeah, exactly.
who was like arguably exploiting people. He's like running a circus type of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? I don't know what his relationship was like with any tribes, but it seemed more of a medicine man type of thing that wasn't super friendly with. And this guy seems like he was just living his life when he could have totally gone the way of Buffalo Bill.
It was there was another story in there which I'm just going to do it off the top of my head. It was about Belle Starr. I think Belle Starr was a famous woman who was an outlaw in the West. And Frank was telling the story that the night that Belle Starr got killed, they had been at a dance. And he said, I even got to dance with her once. He said, but there's this one gentleman who was constantly at her, wanting her to spend time with him. He wanted to go home with her. She was having none of it. Later that night, we asked, when Belle Starr was going home, a few of us asked if she wanted an escort. She said, no, I can take care of myself. She was ambushed by this guy and killed. All of her friends knew it was him, and they rode like 150 miles chasing this guy until they finally caught up to him. And they ended up hanging him with Belle Starr's lariat. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, okay. I mean, that's how you did things back then.
That's how you did things, So,
I mean, that's much more satisfying in that case than a long, drawn-out trial, I suppose. Probably would have gotten away with, because he probably would have said she was asking for it.
Well, as I was said in an earlier part of this podcast where we were talking about how he had that shooting with the two brothers, and they investigated it like it was, a crime, and so it wasn't like people just got away with stuff. And sometimes the justice was just like that, or however they would do it at the time, rather than going through a trial.
Well, yeah, because I'm sure, as soon as I'm sure this will go back in any aspect of history, as soon as law is created, you find that there's problems with the law system that can't be solved.
Yeah, they can't be solved. Well, it was interesting that another a part of that Bud Wells story, to go back to that story, was that Bud didn't want to go before the hanging judge. So Frank fixed it so he ended up in jail somewhere else rather than going to the hanging judge, because he knew the hanging judge would hang him. And as it turned out, like I say, later on, Bud redeemed himself.
Well, maybe he had an instinct about him, and he was giving him one more chance.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Okay.
Seems like a cool guy. And he lived how long? You said
97.
97. I like it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, is it that time?
It's that time.
All right. So you tell me all these nice things, and then you're gonna, what did I do that deserves the revenge?
Of the grown
of the dad jokes.
Okay, we're getting down to the final thing. A guy walked into a bar. Then he was disqualified in the limbo contest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got an anonymous compliment about my parking skills today. It said, parking fine.
Yeah.
Yep. I should have poured my root beer into a square glass. I hate beer. I don't get that one.
Oh, you know what? Okay. All right. That's
okay.
So it's a square root joke.
Oh, there you go. That's right. Square root. Thank you.
Because the square root of root beer is beer, I guess. I don't know math.
I don't know why. I'm reading it right now and I'm thinking, what?
What did I just say to you?
And this is all because the calendar's days are numbered. So I'm going to start planning its funeral. I used to fill my tires for free, but now it costs $1. I guess that's the inflation everybody's talking about.
I saw that one coming. Oh, no.
I'm such a morning person that I don't even need an alarm clock. That, and I drink a gallon of water before I go to bed.
Okay.
Okay.
Is that it?
That's it. Had enough?
Is the yes.
Drip, drip, drip.
You got water torture. Now I have to pee. All right, guys. That's it. We have to pee now. Bye.
Bye.
Daddy wasn't finding a powwow. Daddy wasn't finding a powwow. I've got a little cat. I'm very fond of that. I'd rather have a big powwow.
She's been messing with that thing for the last 5 minutes. Isabel, do you have to turn on the vacuum while we're recording? Get out of here. What do you think you're doing? Really? Really? Why don't you tell me about it? Tell me what you're doing. Get out of here. Yep, she did it again. Little shithead. Get out of here.
Can you unplug it?
I think I better.
She's going to keep doing it.
Does this? She's soaking wet. Hold on. You little shit. You never cause me these problems. I got my work cut out for me with this episode.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. There's a lot of stuff that's got to be taken out there.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I have fun with it.